Yeah, I'm going to talk very much from the practitioner's point of view this afternoon. So looking at our operational practice, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need hydrological ensembles at the Flood Forecasting Centre. Essentially, I'll talk about what we do, what we're going to do, and what we'd like to do. And I'll explain some of the constraints and difficulties that we have in doing that. So a little bit of background about the Flood Forecasting Centre. It's a partnership between the Met Office and the Environment Agency. The Met Office, of course, producing weather forecasts, and the Environment Agency being responsible for river flood warnings. There was, in 2007, there was some very serious flooding in the United Kingdom. And as a result of that, a need was identified to produce more of a flood overview for a longer period of time, because the Met Office were identifying weather events well in advance. The Environment Agency local catchment hydrologists weren't really talking about that until it was 2 days away. The principal recipients of our products are emergency responders, those people that are identified as Category 1 and 2 responders under UK law. And we're also briefing up to government people. In contrast to the Environment Agency, which really deals with river flooding and coastal flooding, the Flood Forecasting Centre has a remit to forecast for all sources of flooding, so that includes surface water, flash flooding, and also groundwater flooding. And as well as providing a 24-hour operational service, we're also bringing in new science, and we have a remit to pull through new science into operational practice. So our principal product, the way that we get across this 5-day flood risk overview is with a thing called the flood guidance statement, and that's issued to the emergency responders and to a variety of other recipients each day. And as I say, it gives a 5-day overview, issued to about 2,300 recipients. And importantly, it's a county scale product. And when we start to think about probabilities, because this is essentially a probabilistic product, the range of county sizes becomes quite important. So the range of areas that we're forecasting for here goes from about 33 kilometres up to over 8,000 kilometres. And that's a potential source of quite a lot of difficulty when you're producing an aerial probability. As I say, it's a risk-based product, and this is the matrix that we use to get across the flood risk. So the colour is not simply the severity, it's a combination of the likelihood and the severity. So for example, a yellow colour can be a medium likelihood of minor impacts, or it could be a very low likelihood of severe impacts. And it's quite an important point is that the recipients of the flood guidance statement are trained in the use of this flood risk matrix, so that it's not supposed to be a product which can be picked up by a member of the public and just used. So having established the potential impact, we then have to give an idea of the likelihood of that impact. And at the moment, that's quite a subjective assessment that we make. It would be nice if that was a much more objective assessment, and that's something that we're working towards. But in contrast to the example we were hearing about earlier, where you can make a nice, with the hydropower example, where you can make quite a neat cost-loss assessment as to the use of my ensemble will result in X number of euros gain over a certain period. I think with this type of product, it's much harder to do, and that's partly because of the risk appetite of the recipients, and that changes over time. So for example, if there's been recent flooding, the risk appetite in the recipients and in the government might shift slightly. At the moment, we're in a period where we're leading up to an election in the UK, and that also changes the risk appetite of the people in government who are seen as being overall responsible for the country's response to flooding. In order to establish the flood risk, we use a number of tools. It's worth stressing that in the day 1 to 2 period, we're quite heavily reliant still on local catchment modelers. So there are teams around the country who are the hydrologists who do catchment scale modelling, and we'll rely quite heavily on their input for that period. But for giving us the overall idea of fluvial flood response over the whole of the 5-day period, we use the grid-to-grid model, which was developed by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Just very briefly, essentially it's a 1-kilometre grid of England and Wales. Each grid cell uses a method known as probability distributed moisture, which again is a technique developed by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to produce grid cell runoff, and the grid cell runoff is then routed through to river cells, and then a fairly simple hydrological routing scheme transfers the water down the rivers. The grid-to-grid model is not just used for the flood guidance statement, and there's a number of other uses at the moment. So we're looking to support catchment river modelling, so where, for example, distributed hydrological models need ungauged inputs, the grid-to-grid model will be used for that. Also supporting local warnings for rapid response catchments, and that's something that we've been challenged to do by the highest levels of government in terms of producing some kind of low probability risk for flash flooding. And we're also looking at using the model for assessing surface water flood risk. The models run in 3 main configurations. So we run a 5-day deterministic model that uses a nowcast rainfall input, followed by the 1.5 kilometre UKV model, and that's out to 36 hours. And then from 36 hours onwards, we use the Euro 4 model, which is a downscaled version of the Met Office global model. And that has 2 inputs, which are rainfall and snowmelt. So that's how we handle snow within the grid-to-grid model. So that's our deterministic model, which goes out to 5 days. We then use an ensemble model out to 32 hours, which is the MOGUTS UK model. It's a 2.2 kilometre convection resolving meteorological ensemble. We then time lag that once we've run it through the grid-to-grid model, so we have a 26-hour ensemble with 48 members. And finally, we have a nowcast ensemble, which uses the steps, which is essentially a statistical way of generating an ensemble rather than a meteorological technique. That produces 24 members out to 7 hours, which we run through the grid-to-grid model, and time lag to 48 members with a 6-hour forecast. And all those rainfall inputs are based on the Met Office unified model. In the last month, we've finally moved the grid-to-grid model. It used to run on the Delft-Fuse software. It's now still very much connected to the Delft-Fuse software, but the actual grid-to-grid model run, forecast run, takes place on the Met Office supercomputer. And ultimately that should give us the capacity to run larger ensembles and produce faster results. So just a few examples of how we view the output. The output is sent back from the Met Office supercomputer to the Delft-Fuse system, which we run in the Flood Forecasting Centre. So here we're looking at the probability of a forecast warning level being reached. So behind one of the difficulties with looking at gridded data is that you have to generate a flow magnitude assessment. So here we're looking at the return period level, and that's quite a crude calculation, and it's one of the difficulties we have, that particularly in the very tops of the catchments, we can get very spurious estimates of flood return period, and that means, so there's an example there that's come up with a very high, sorry, that's the probability, but it's looking at the 2-year warning level. But it will come up with very high return periods at the tops of catchments quite often. So what we tend to do is we tend to focus in on the gauged locations, and here's an example of the gauged location. So at the top we have a catchment rainfall, so there's the ensemble of rainfall going in there, and we have the ensemble of flow at the bottom, and that's been converted into some quantiles to give the plume view. What's worth noting there is that whilst on the flow ensemble we have it's set against the flood thresholds, on the rainfall view there are no thresholds. So every view you have, regardless of the spread of the ensemble, the maximum member will always be at the top of the graph, and 0 will always be at the bottom of the graph. And I'll come back to that in a moment. In terms of the performance of these ensembles, we don't have a formal verification scheme yet, and that's something that we need to work on. We have an initial study which was based on a previous ensemble generation method, and that does show some improvement over the deterministic. So this is looking at the ability of the model to the ensemble to discriminate between an event and a non-event at the threshold of half of QMED over the 24-hour forecast horizon. So on the left there's the performance, that's relative operating characteristic of the ensemble, and on the right is the relative operating characteristic of a single deterministic member. So already we see an ability to discriminate in the ensemble, and we're very confident that as we move to the MOGREPS UK meteorological ensemble, that will improve still further. In terms of our current developments, the main improvement that we're planning to make at the moment is to extend our ensemble forecasting out to the full 5-day period. So we're currently working on a downscaled version of the global MOGREPS G ensemble. So again, is a Met Office ensemble, which is, I think, 33-kilometre resolution. But run through a hydrological model at that scale just gives such a bland signal that it doesn't really produce anything worth using. So the plan is to downscale that to a 4-kilometre resolution, and that will be a 12-member ensemble, which again will be time-lagged to give 24 members. This is an example of trials of that product. So on the left there's the 33-kilometre raw MOGREPS G member, and essentially there's a process which decomposes the structure of the coarse scale model and imposes noise to give a high resolution signal, and that it requires an ensemble to make it useful, but already it's showing, as a rainfall ensemble, it's showing some skill. So once we've got this MOGREPS G product up and running, our next project will be to establish a proper verification system. There's 3 elements to that process. One is simply gathering the data and putting the infrastructure in place for the verification scheme. Secondly, establishing the baseline performance of the ensemble. And thirdly, we hope to do some optimization of the ensemble. So that's about understanding the optimal ensemble size for a particular catchment size. So whereas we know that, for example, we don't have enough ensemble members for a reliable estimation of rainfall, we think we probably need fewer members to sort out larger catchments. So it may be there's some efficiencies that can be gained by optimizing the size of the ensembles. And the other piece of work is to really home in on how we use and assess the ensembles operationally. So the duty hydrometeorologist has to make quite a quick assessment of an awful lot of data. So when you've got a 1 kilometre grid of England and Wales, and you've got 48 members or so to look at, essentially we need to be able to home in on the signals of the ensemble very quickly, and also to look at where the ensemble is adding value and perhaps telling us something new that we weren't spotting before. An example of that is if we have an ensemble of rainfall which has got a large amount of spread on it, and an ensemble of flow as a result of that rainfall which has got a small spread, then that might be telling us that our hydrological system is quite insensitive, so it doesn't really matter how much rainfall we get, we're going to cross our flood threshold. Rather, it doesn't matter where we are in our ensemble, we're going to cross the flood threshold. Conversely, we might have a small spread in our rainfall and a large spread in the flow, and that's telling us that our hydrological system is kind of poised, and it's very important whether we are at the bottom of the ensemble or the top of the ensemble. So what we need to be able to do is to say how big is the spread of the rainfall on a particular day. And at the moment we have no way of doing that other than just by eye and by experience. So we need to get to a point where we have sufficient understanding of the climatology of the ensemble that we can effectively normalize the plot of rainfall ensemble. Further ahead, at the moment our ensemble is purely based on rainfall. We don't have any way of describing the uncertainty through the hydrological system, and that's something that we should probably be looking into and we'll start to work towards. And finally, with new Met Office computing power on the way, we hope we can get a little corner of that and perhaps run some larger ensembles if our optimization tells us that we need to do so. So I'll finish there and happy to take any questions.
Yes, you have any questions?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions. The first one, I was at CMS recently, and in a session there we had a discussion amongst various people talking about the ability of private people to produce an unbiased forecast. And the consensus amongst the people there was, when you read about 2, 3, 4 kilometres, pretty much every model in the world predicts convective rainfall. That seems to be the fundamental problem of working at that kind of pseudo-grade scale area. So the first question is the sort of forecasting centre, do you sort of take account of that in any kind of subjective or objective way? I think the guidance of the methods from time to time is often say high resolution models over predicting this is kind of the same stuff. And then my second question was, you talked about pound scaling global model out to 5 days or whatever, but then you said you implied that was being done numerically, and then the example you showed was kind of statistical. So I don't quite understand what you do.
Okay, yeah. First question, how do we account for the over-prediction of convective rainfall in the high-resolution models? Essentially, we do that subjectively at the moment. We don't have an objective way of doing it. We do take it into account because we have a reasonably good idea of the conditions in which the models overdo convection. So, for example, we look at the height of the freezing level relative to the instability in the meteorological situation, and that will give us a rough idea of whether the model is going to overpredict or not. But we don't have an objective way of dealing with that at the moment. And I've completely forgot what the second question was. I do apologise, Tim. Oh, downscaling. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, MAGRIPS G is, as you know, is a meteorological ensemble, whereas MOGATS UK is a meteorological ensemble. MOGATS G is which we're not downscaling. MOGATS G is a meteorological ensemble that we are statistically downscaling. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, you put that 12 members and 24 members.
It's only with the MOGATS G, it will just be time lagging to 24 members. So it will be the 12 members of MOGATS G, and each one will be statistically downscaled, and then run through the G2G model, and then time lagged. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Last question?
Then you have this flood risk matrix. How do you have some generalized way to assess this potential impact in different catchments on this, on the x-axis, this impact? How do you do that?
Yeah, so how do we assess the severity of the impact? We have a qualitative matrix which gives us essentially a list of conditions which might be met. So we assess the flow predictions will give us an idea of whether we're looking at simply out-of-bank conditions, which might give us minimal impacts. So perhaps roads flooded and disruption to traffic. And then when we get to higher flood return periods, we then say we're starting to move into a significant flooding. But, and that has to match with a set of qualitative points, which we then agree with the local flood hydrologists as well. So we have to get their agreement that those conditions might be met by these flows.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to